The subway station was bustling with the usual noise, the faint rumble of trains in the distance, the quick pace of people walking to and fro, the crackling announcements from the loudspeakers. It was a busy Friday evening, the kind where everyone seemed to be rushing home after a long week. And, like most evenings, no one really paid attention to the older woman sitting on the bench near the platform. Her name was Marjorie. She was in her early 70s, with thick silver hair that framed her face like a halo. She was the kind of person who still dressed in the classic styles from a bygone era. A floral dress, a cardigan, sensible shoes, everything about her seemed to scream grandmother, even though she had never had children of her own. She enjoyed her quiet life, reading books in parks, attending knitting clubs, and most of all, taking long rides on the subway, watching the city from the safety of her seat. She never bothered anyone, and no one ever bothered her. But today, something was different. Standing just across the platform, watching the crowd move in and out of the trains, was a man named Raymond. He wasn't particularly tall or imposing, but there was something about him that looked off. Perhaps it was the way he was lingering a little too long near the entrance of the train, or the way his eyes darted around like a predator on the hunt. Raymond had learned the art of blending in. He wasn't here to be noticed, but he was definitely here for something. Raymond's plan was simple: grab a bag, run, disappear into the sea of people. The bag he was eyeing was easy to spot. It was the older woman's purse, sitting innocently beside her on the bench, its leather strap glistening under the fluorescent lights. He'd been watching her for the past few minutes, waiting for the right moment. She seemed oblivious to the world around her, her eyes glued to the book in her hands. Raymond was patient. He'd been down this road before, and he knew the tricks. The key was to remain calm, to move quickly but not too quickly, to seem like he belonged. He had done this countless times in various cities, on buses, trains, even airports. People were predictable. They didn't pay attention to their surroundings, and that made them easy targets. As the train doors began to close, Raymond's pulse quickened. It was almost time. The elderly woman was still engrossed in her book, completely unaware of the approaching danger. He took a step toward her, carefully calculating the distance. In his mind, he was already picturing the smooth motion of his hand reaching down to snatch the bag and then running toward the exit. But just as he was about to make his move, something caught his eye. A large figure had stepped onto the platform from a side entrance. At first, Raymond thought it was just another commuter. But as the figure moved closer, it became clear that this wasn't an ordinary person. It was a man, tall, muscular, and dressed in a simple black hoodie and sweatpants. But it wasn't just his size that made Raymond's stomach tighten. It was the unmistakable face of a legend, Mike Tyson, the former heavyweight boxing champion. Raymond froze, his mind racing. Tyson wasn't just any celebrity. He was one of the most famous boxers in the world, known for his raw power and unpredictable temper. The last place Raymond wanted to get into any kind of trouble was in front of Mike Tyson. This was not the kind of guy you messed with. For a moment, Raymond considered backing off, pretending he wasn't planning to do anything. But his desire for the purse overpowered his fear. The bag was still there, and Tyson wasn't looking in his direction. Raymond was good at what he did, quick and subtle. He could grab the purse and be gone before anyone knew what happened. Tyson would just be another commuter in the background. But the problem was that Tyson was no ordinary commuter. Raymond noticed that Tyson wasn't simply passing through the station. He was making his way toward the bench where Marjorie sat, his head slightly turned as if he was scanning the crowd. The closer he got, the more Raymond's nerves began to fray. Tyson didn't look like he was in a hurry. He wasn't rushing to catch a train, he was strolling. He had the kind of calm demeanor that spoke of a man who knew he could handle anything. Raymond glanced back at Marjorie. She hadn't noticed Tyson yet, lost in her book, completely unaware of the tension building in the air. It was then that something strange happened. Mike Tyson, who had been walking slowly toward the bench, stopped just a few feet away from Marjorie. For a moment, Raymond thought he might say something to her, maybe ask for directions or make some small talk, as strangers sometimes did on the subway. But no. Tyson simply stood there, his eyes focused intently on the book in Marjorie's hands. For what seemed like an eternity, Raymond watched, trying to figure out what Tyson was doing. Was he planning to approach the old woman? Was he going to sit down beside her? Maybe Tyson just liked the solitude of the subway, Raymond thought, or maybe he was waiting for a train to arrive. But Tyson wasn't waiting for a train. He wasn't even standing still out of casual interest. Instead, he slowly turned his head and locked eyes with Raymond, who felt his heart skip a beat. There was no mistaking the gaze. Tyson was looking directly at him. For the briefest moment, Raymond's instincts screamed at him to turn and run. But he couldn't. His feet were glued to the floor. Tyson's expression was unreadable, but there was a certain calmness to his demeanor that sent a chill down Raymond's spine. And then, without breaking eye contact, Tyson did something that Raymond couldn't quite comprehend. He smiled. Tyson's smile wasn't a warm, friendly one. It was the kind of smile that seemed to come from a man who had seen everything, and perhaps had done everything. It was knowing, but not in a mocking way. More like he could sense exactly what was happening, and that he found the whole situation amusing. For Raymond, it was a smile that sent a wave of panic through him. For a second, he thought he might be hallucinating. Maybe his nerves were playing tricks on him. Maybe Tyson wasn't really looking at him, and maybe the smile wasn't for him at all. But no. It was definitely for him. And what made it worse was that Tyson wasn't moving, he was standing still, watching, letting Raymond feel the weight of his gaze. The train doors behind Raymond suddenly slammed shut, and the sound made him jump. Tyson's gaze didn't falter. It was then that Raymond realized something. Tyson wasn't just standing there. He was positioning himself between Raymond and Marjorie. The moment became painfully clear. Raymond wasn't going to be able to take the purse anymore. If he tried, Tyson would probably stop him. And what's more, Tyson wasn't going to just stop him in a polite, "Hey, man, don't do that" kind of way. No, this was Tyson. The same man who had become famous for knocking out opponents in the first round, the same man who had built a reputation as one of the fiercest fighters in the world. The kind of man you didn't mess with. Raymond was seconds away from being in a very bad situation. His palms began to sweat. His mouth went dry. It was almost as if Tyson had read his thoughts, because the boxer took one step closer to him. Just one step, but it was enough. Enough for Raymond to feel the distance close, enough for him to feel the shift in the air, the subtle pressure that seemed to come from Tyson's presence. "Hey," Tyson said, his voice low, but it carried. It wasn't a greeting, it wasn't a question. It was just a word, a simple, singular word that conveyed everything Raymond needed to know. Tyson wasn't just going to let him make a move. Tyson was watching him. And whatever Raymond was planning, Tyson knew about it. Raymond's mouth opened, but no words came out. His brain was scrambled. He wasn't sure if he should apologize, flee, or pretend that nothing was happening at all. His heart was racing, and his mind was a blur of desperate thoughts, but there was no escaping the reality of the moment. Mike Tyson was standing right there. Marjorie, still absorbed in her book, hadn't yet noticed the shift in the air. She was unaware of the tension that had gripped the platform, unaware that the purse she had placed beside her was the center of a confrontation. Raymond glanced down at it one last time, and then, as if the moment had broken him, he turned his attention back to Tyson. The boxer didn't say anything more, but he didn't need to. The look in his eyes, calm and unblinking, said it all. Tyson had been through worse situations than this, and he wasn't going to tolerate any nonsense. Raymond's eyes darted around. He needed an escape, but there was none. He couldn't run toward the exit now. Tyson had blocked him in. The only way out was past him, and Raymond wasn't sure if he could get that far. Just when Raymond thought he might suffocate from the pressure of the situation, Tyson did something completely unexpected. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and began to scroll. It was as if he had completely disregarded Raymond's existence for a moment, as if the confrontation had been nothing more than a brief pause in the boxer's day. Raymond wasn't sure whether to be relieved or terrified. Maybe Tyson had lost interest, maybe he was simply passing the time. But just as quickly as the tension had risen, it evaporated. Tyson's eyes flickered toward the bench. He looked down at the purse. Without saying a word, he crouched down and grabbed it, gently lifting it off the seat and placing it into Marjorie's lap. He didn't speak, didn't draw attention to his actions. He just placed it there, as if to make a silent statement. Raymond felt like he had just been hit by a train. He didn't know what was happening anymore. Tyson had just done what? Had he just protected the purse? Was he giving it back to the woman? Raymond had been so certain that Tyson would stop him, maybe even intervene physically, but instead, Tyson had just neutralized the whole situation with a single action. It was almost as though Raymond had never existed in the first place. Tyson stood up and took a step back. His smile was gone now. He wasn't threatening or angry, but his demeanor was that of a man who had simply observed something that was beneath him. The look on his face was one of quiet amusement, the kind you might see in a parent watching a child do something foolish, but with no desire to correct it. He turned around slowly, nodding as if to acknowledge that the situation was over. Raymond stood there for a moment, still frozen, unsure of what to do. The train had just arrived, and passengers were beginning to move toward the open doors. Tyson was already stepping onto the train, his presence casting a long shadow on the platform. Raymond felt a strange mixture of humiliation and relief. He wasn't sure if he had just been saved or if he had narrowly avoided a much worse fate. Marjorie, completely oblivious to the events that had unfolded in front of her, looked up from her book. She adjusted the purse in her lap and smiled faintly. "Oh, thank you," she murmured, although she didn't seem to be speaking to anyone in particular. Raymond blinked, his mind still catching up to the events. Mike Tyson had just saved the purse, and Raymond had done nothing but stand there, too paralyzed to move. Tyson had intervened without a single word of warning, and now, Raymond realized, he wasn't even sure if he should be angry or grateful. As the train doors closed and the subway rumbled into motion, Raymond finally took a step back. He hadn't stolen the purse. He hadn't caused a scene. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a strange sense of shame wash over him, not for trying to steal, but for having been outdone by a man who didn't even need to raise a finger to make him feel small. Raymond watched as the subway train began to move, its wheels screeching against the tracks. Tyson was already on it, sitting in one of the seats, his large frame filling the space with an undeniable aura of authority. He had done nothing overtly violent, no grand gestures, yet Raymond felt smaller than he ever had in his life. He had planned to take the purse from the old woman, but instead, it was as if the universe had conspired to stop him. The crowd around him continued as if nothing had happened. Commuters shuffled in and out of the station, some barely glancing at him as they passed. Raymond stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of the bizarre encounter, trying to understand why he felt like a fraud, like a criminal who had never truly had the courage to commit his crime. He finally turned away from the platform and made his way to the escalators. His legs felt heavy, his feet dragging with each step as he ascended. It wasn't as though he had been scared of Tyson, not exactly. It was something deeper than that, something about the way the boxer had acted. He wasn't afraid of Raymond, nor did he seem concerned. It was as if Tyson had known exactly what kind of man Raymond was, and the mere thought of confronting him was laughable. Tyson didn't need to show force. He had already won the battle. Raymond's mind swirled with questions. How had Tyson known? Was it just the way Raymond had been looking at the purse? Had Tyson spotted him as a threat immediately, or had he been watching the entire scene unfold from the beginning? Raymond couldn't say. What he did know was that Tyson had made him feel small, insignificant, like a child trying to play a game with grown-ups. He didn't even deserve to be in the same room as Tyson. By the time he reached the street, it was dark outside. The chill of the night air hit him like a slap. Raymond pulled the collar of his jacket up, wrapping his arms around his body. The city felt colder now, somehow emptier. He had originally planned to grab a quick bite to eat, but his stomach twisted at the thought. The excitement of the day had long since passed, and all that remained was a sense of disillusionment. He wandered aimlessly, not really knowing where he was going. His feet led him to a park where a few homeless people huddled under blankets, and some late-night joggers passed by, their breath visible in the cold air. There was something strangely comforting about the solitude of the park, though Raymond wasn't sure why. The city seemed to fade away here. He could hear the distant hum of traffic, but it felt muffled, as though he had stepped into another world. He sat down on a bench under a tree, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He had been living on the fringes for years now, never quite fitting in anywhere. Always looking for the next quick score, the next easy way to make a little extra money. But now, sitting here, he felt like a ghost. The events of the day felt surreal, as though he had been caught in a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. Had he really thought he could just walk up to an old woman and take her purse? And even if he had, how could he have been so foolish to think that no one would notice? That no one would stop him? And then there was Tyson. The boxer had been like a force of nature, calm, composed, and absolutely indifferent to Raymond's existence. He hadn't threatened him, hadn't even raised his voice. Yet Raymond felt as though he had been completely seen, his every thought and desire laid bare in an instant. Maybe I'm not cut out for this, Raymond muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. He had always thought he could outsmart the system, get by on his wits and his ability to blend into the background. But today had been different. Tyson had broken him, not with violence or intimidation, but with simple presence. He had shown Raymond just how small he really was. A shiver ran down Raymond's spine, not from the cold but from the realization of how easy it had been for Tyson to completely control the situation. The boxer hadn't even needed to raise his fists. He hadn't needed to do anything other than be himself. And Raymond, in contrast, had been a man with nothing but a desperate need to survive in a world that didn't care about him. Raymond sat in silence for a while longer, his mind racing. It wasn't like him to be introspective, he wasn't the kind of man to sit around and feel sorry for himself. But this was different. He had failed in the simplest way possible. He hadn't just been stopped. He had been dismissed, reduced to nothing in the eyes of a man who didn't even care enough to break a sweat. Finally, Raymond got to his feet, his muscles stiff from sitting too long. He needed to get away from this park, from this self-pity. He needed to find something else to distract him. Something that would take his mind off of Tyson, off of the ridiculous idea that he had ever thought he could outwit the world. As he walked back toward the street, he passed a small corner store. Its neon lights flickered in the darkness, and through the window, Raymond could see a stack of magazines and snacks. The glow of the lights was a sharp contrast to the shadows of the park, and for a moment, Raymond hesitated. He didn't know what he was looking for, maybe just something to occupy his hands, something to fill the emptiness he felt inside. But then, he saw something in the window, a magazine with a familiar face on the cover. It was Mike Tyson. Raymond's breath caught in his throat. The cover of the magazine showed Tyson in his prime, his fists clenched, his eyes fierce. And beneath the headline, in bold letters, it read, "The World's Most Dangerous Man." For a brief moment, Raymond stood frozen, staring at the cover. Then, with a mixture of disbelief and resignation, he turned away and walked off into the night. Tyson's face, still burning in his memory, stayed with him. And for the first time in a long time, Raymond realized that maybe the real world wasn't a place where you could always get away with things. Maybe, just maybe, it was time for him to reconsider his approach to life. Raymond wandered through the streets, his thoughts still swirling. He had come to the uncomfortable realization that he wasn't cut out for this life, the quick fixes, the shortcuts, the constant game of trying to outwit the world. He had tried so many times, always believing he was one step ahead, but today had been different. Tyson had shattered whatever illusion of control Raymond had been clinging to. And for the first time in years, Raymond didn't feel like he could trust his instincts. They had led him to that moment in the subway, and they had failed him. As he walked, his eyes dropped to the sidewalk. His thoughts kept returning to Tyson, to the effortless way the boxer had defused the entire situation with a mere gesture. It wasn't just that Tyson was physically imposing, Raymond knew that. It was something else, something deeper. The way Tyson had simply existed in the moment, the way his presence had commanded the space without any need to prove anything. Raymond realized Tyson wasn't just a fighter, he was a man who had lived through his battles and come out the other side with an understanding of life that Raymond hadn't yet grasped. Tyson had lived through his own darkness and found peace, while Raymond was still caught in the struggle to survive, constantly fighting for a fleeting sense of control. Raymond's steps slowed as he came to a crossroads. The city felt different now, darker somehow. He didn't want to go back to his apartment, it was empty and cold, filled with the remnants of a life he didn't want to look at anymore. But where else was there to go? He wasn't sure, but his feet seemed to lead him to a nearby diner. It was a small, run-down place, with flickering neon lights that could barely be seen through the grime on the windows. It wasn't the kind of place Raymond would usually stop at, but something about it felt like a refuge. Maybe it was the warmth coming from the inside, the smell of frying eggs and coffee that filled the air. Maybe it was the anonymity of the place, no one would ask questions here, no one would judge. He pushed open the door and walked in. The bell above the door jingled as Raymond entered, and the old man behind the counter looked up briefly, nodding as Raymond took a seat at the counter. The place was nearly empty, save for a couple of people nursing cups of coffee in the corner. The low hum of conversation mixed with the sizzle of bacon on the grill. Raymond sat in the nearest stool, letting the warmth of the diner settle around him like a blanket. "What can I get you?" the old man asked, his voice gravelly. Raymond hesitated for a moment before ordering a cup of coffee. He didn't need much. He wasn't really hungry, but something about the simple, familiar routine of it, sitting down, ordering a drink, waiting, felt grounding. The diner was a quiet place, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. As he waited, he thought again about Tyson. About the look in his eyes. Tyson hadn't been a hero, he hadn't been a savior. But in a strange way, he had done something far more important, he had given Raymond a glimpse of something better, something he hadn't even known he was searching for. "That'll be $2, the old man said, bringing him a mug of coffee. Raymond looked at the mug for a moment before reaching for his wallet. He was about to pay when he realized something, he wasn't sure when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, he had stopped thinking about the purse, about the quick score. He wasn't even angry at himself anymore. The weight that had been pressing on him since the subway had slowly begun to lift. He placed the money on the counter, but before the old man could take it, Raymond paused. "Keep the change," he muttered. It wasn't much, just a couple of dollars, but the act felt important. Like a small step, a shift in the right direction. As if, for the first time in a long while, he was making a conscious choice to be better, to be different. Not perfect, but trying. Raymond took a long sip of the coffee, the bitter warmth running down his throat, and for the first time in what felt like ages, he exhaled deeply. He didn't know where he would go from here, but somehow, he felt as though the world had opened up to him just a little bit. He hadn't gotten what he wanted that day. He hadn't stolen the purse. But perhaps that was for the best. He had been forced to confront something he hadn't been ready to face. The sound of the diner door jingling as another customer entered broke his thoughts. Raymond glanced up for a moment and then returned his focus to the cup in his hands. The quiet rhythm of life went on around him, and in that small moment, Raymond realized that maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop chasing things that weren't meant to be. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel a quiet peace.